She was 26 years old the autumn her father died, and by the time the lawyer finished reading the will out loud in his cramped little office, Josephine Hartwell had exactly $14.60 to her name. Everything else was gone. The house on Larch Street had gone to the bank. Her father's tools, his horse, even his good winter coat, had gone to pay the debts he'd left behind like stones in his pockets. All that remained, tucked into a single dusty line at the bottom of the will, was a worthless stretch of scrubland, 2 miles outside Cedar Falls. A place folks called Widow's Fork, where a sulfur spring bubbled up through cracked rock, and stank so bad that no rancher would run cattle near it. The town had a good laugh over that one. Poor Josie Hartwell, 26 and unmarried, left nothing but a smelly hole in the ground. Only one creature in Cedar Falls did not laugh. He sat pressed against her skirts through the whole reading, ears low, a big brindle mutt named Samson, who had followed her father home from a cattle drive 6 years back, and never once looked at another soul the way he looked at her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hartwell and her faithful dog Samson. Before we go on, we want to ask you something. Have you ever been handed the thing everybody else called worthless, and had to decide for yourself what it was really worth? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Josephine's father, Thomas Hartwell, had not been a rich man, not by the standards of Cedar Falls, but he had been a careful one, and careful men in that town were supposed to end their days comfortable. He kept the books for half the merchants on Main Street, a small, quiet, patient man, with ink-stained fingers, and a habit of humming while he worked. Josephine's earliest memories were of sitting on the floor of his little office, sorting scraps of paper into piles while he taught her numbers the way other fathers taught their daughters to sew. "A ledger never lies, Josie," he used to say, tapping the page with one bony finger. "People lie. Numbers tell the truth, if you're patient enough to listen." She grew up believing that, and it had served her well. By the time she was 17, she could balance a set of books faster than most grown men in town, though nobody thought to pay a young woman for that kind of work, so she balanced her father's books for free, and dreamed, quietly, of one day keeping her own. Her mother had died when Josephine was 9, of a fever that swept through Cedar Falls one hard winter, and took 6 other souls with her. After that, it was just the two of them, Thomas and Josie, in the small house on Larch Street, with the crooked porch step he never got around to fixing. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not say the soft words some fathers said, but he showed his love in other ways, in the way he saved the good apples for her, in the way he sat up late some nights, just to hear about her day, in the way he never once, not on his worst days, made her feel like a burden. She remembered the winters best, the two of them close by the stove, while he worked through some merchant's tangled accounts, the smell of wood smoke and old paper filling the little house, his humming low and tuneless under his breath. He taught her to read a column of figures the way other girls were taught to read scripture, with the same patience, the same quiet reverence. "Every number's got a story behind it, Josie," he told her once, "if you're willing to sit with it long enough to hear it." She did not know yet how true those words would turn out to be, nor how long she would end up sitting with the numbers he left behind. She thought they would have years yet. She was wrong. It started with a cough that fall, the kind that seemed harmless at first, the kind half the town had. But Thomas Hartwell's cough did not pass with the changing weather. It settled into his chest like a tenant that would not leave, and by the time the doctor came around to call it consumption, it had already taken most of what strength he had left. Josephine nursed him through that winter with everything she had. She sat by his bed, reading him the same 3 books, over and over, because they were the only ones he owned, her voice going hoarse some nights before he finally drifted off. She spooned broth between his lips when he was too weak to hold the bowl himself, wiped his brow with a damp cloth when the fever climbed, kept the little stove burning through nights so cold her breath fogged even indoors. She held his hand through the worst of the coughing fits, when his whole body shook, and his eyes went wide and frightened in a way she had never seen before, not once, not in 26 years, and she learned, that winter, exactly how much a person could carry before they broke, and how much further than that they could still go when there was no one else to carry it. He died in the first week of March, with the last of the snow still gray and stubborn on the ground, and Samson lying pressed against his legs the whole night through, refusing to move even when Josephine tried gently to coax him away. It was only after the funeral that she learned the full weight of what her father had been hiding. He had borrowed against the house 2 years earlier, quietly, without telling her, to cover a bad investment gone wrong, a mining claim up in the hills that had promised silver and delivered nothing but empty tunnels and broken promises. He had been paying the debt down slowly, month by month, hoping to clear it before she ever had to know. The consumption had taken him before he could finish. The bank held the note, and the bank, in the person of a soft-spoken, sharp-eyed man named Silas Crane, was not inclined toward mercy. What Josephine did not know yet, and would not learn for some months still, was that her father's silence about Widow's Fork had never been carelessness at all. Josephine remembered standing in Crane's office 3 weeks after the funeral, watching him slide papers across his desk with the same gentle, patient smile he wore for every occasion, whether he was granting a loan or foreclosing on a widow. "I truly am sorry for your loss, Miss Hartwell," he said, and something in the way he said it made her skin crawl, though she could not have told you why. "But a debt is a debt. The house will need to be sold to satisfy it." He did not meet her eyes when he said it. He was already looking past her, toward the ledger open on his desk, toward numbers that mattered to him far more than she did. She lost the house within the month. She lost the furniture, the tools, the horse, piece by piece, sold off to satisfy a debt that had never once been hers. Friends who had known her family for 20 years grew suddenly busy whenever she passed on the street, the particular busyness of people who did not want to be asked for help. She moved into a single rented room above the mercantile, paid for with what little coin she had left, and she sat at the small table by the window some nights, and wondered what her father would have made of it all. The house gone, the town's sympathy thinning fast, nothing left in the world but a stubborn brindle dog who refused to leave her side. It was Samson who had come to them strangest of all, 6 years back, trailing a cattle drive that passed through Cedar Falls one hot August. He'd shown up at their gate half-starved, ribs showing, one ear torn, and Thomas Hartwell, careful man that he was, had taken one look at the animal and gone inside for a bowl of scraps without a word of debate. "Some creatures just find their people," he told Josephine that night, scratching the dog's ragged ears. "You don't choose them so much as they choose you." The dog had never left. He slept at the foot of Thomas's bed for 6 years, and on the night Thomas died, he had simply moved his loyalty, without complaint, to Josephine, as though some quiet arrangement had been settled between the two of them that she was never meant to overhear. Now it was just her and Samson, in a rented room above the mercantile, with $14.60 and a worthless parcel of stinking land 2 miles out of town. She thought about selling it. Silas Crane had, in fact, offered to buy it from her the same week the will was read, a small, almost embarrassed sum, as if he were doing her a kindness by taking a useless piece of scrubland off her hands. Something about the offer had not sat right with her, though she could not name what. Her father had never spoken of that land in his life, not once, and yet in his will, written and sealed a full 2 years before he ever fell sick, he had made certain, deliberately, specifically, that Widow's Fork would come to her, and no one else, and to no bank, whatever else was lost. She sat in her small rented room the night before she was to give Crane her answer, Samson's head heavy across her feet, and she thought of her father's voice. "A ledger never lies, people lie, numbers tell the truth, if you're patient enough to listen." She did not understand yet what her father had known. But something told her, some old stubborn instinct passed down through years of watching him work, that a man as careful as Thomas Hartwell did not leave a thing to chance, and did not leave a worthless scrap of land to his only daughter, unless it was worth something after all. In the morning, she walked into the land office and told the clerk she would be keeping Widow's Fork. The land office was small and smelled of tobacco and old paper, and the clerk behind the counter, a stooped man named Pruitt, looked at her the way half the town had looked at her since the funeral, with a mixture of pity and mild embarrassment, as though she had announced she meant to marry a scarecrow. "You understand, there's nothing out there, Miss Hartwell," he said, sliding the deed transfer papers across the counter along with a request for the small filing fee required to formalize the claim in her name. "Sulfur spring, some scrub pine, a half-collapsed old bathhouse, nobody's used in 20 years. Mr. Crane's offer was more than fair, if you don't mind my saying." "I don't mind you saying it," Josephine answered, counting out the fee in careful coins from her thin purse. "I still mean to keep it." Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, the way it always did, and by the time she walked out of the land office with the deed folded in her coat pocket, she could feel eyes on her from the porch of the general store, from the open door of the barber shop, from the two women gossiping outside the church hall. Somebody laughed, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either. "Poor Josie Hartwell," she heard one of them say, not troubling to lower her voice much. "First she loses her father, then she loses her good sense right along with him." Silas Crane himself stood outside the bank as she passed, arms folded, that same patient, unbothered smile fixed on his face. "You're a braver woman than most, Miss Hartwell, holding onto a piece of land like that," he said, and there was something underneath the pleasant words that she did not like. A thin edge of amusement, or maybe something closer to relief, poorly disguised as concern. "My offer stands, should you change your mind. No shame in it." "I won't be changing my mind, Mr. Crane," she said, and kept walking, Samson trotting steady at her heel, unbothered by the stares, unbothered by the whispers, watching Crane with an expression Josephine could not quite name, but did not entirely like either. A low, wary stillness, ears pricked forward, that lasted until they had turned the corner and left the man well behind them. She walked the 2 miles out to Widow's Fork that same afternoon, wanting to see with her own eyes the thing she had chosen over easy money and the town's good opinion. The land was every bit as sorry as Pruitt had promised. Scrub pine grew crooked and thin, across a stretch of cracked gray earth. The sulfur spring itself sat low in a shallow basin, steam curling faintly off its surface, even in the cool spring air, the smell of rotten eggs thick enough to make her cover her nose with her sleeve. Beyond it stood the old bathhouse, a sagging wooden structure with a caved-in roof, and a door hanging loose on one rusted hinge, the kind of building that looked like a strong wind might finish what time had already started. She stood at the edge of the property for a long while, the wind picking at her skirts, and felt something close to despair settle over her. Pruitt was right. Crane was right. The whole town was right. She had traded $14 of dignity for a smelly hole in the ground and a rotting shed, and there was nothing here, nothing at all, to suggest her father had known something the rest of them did not. Samson had other ideas. While Josephine stood there, taking stock of everything she had lost, Samson had already gone ahead of her, nose low, moving in slow deliberate circles around the base of the old bathhouse, in a way she had never quite seen him move before. He was not sniffing the way a dog sniffs at rabbit trails or old fence posts, distracted and quick. This was different, careful, almost ceremonial, his whole body low and focused, tail held still instead of wagging, the way he got right before a storm, when the air itself seemed to change and only he could feel it coming. "Samson," she called, but he did not come. He circled the bathhouse once, twice, pausing at the sagging doorway to sniff along the base of the frame, and then he simply stopped, dead still, one paw raised slightly off the ground, staring into the dark gap of the broken door, as though something inside had reached out and taken hold of him. Josephine felt a small chill move up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the cool spring wind. She had seen Samson still before, seen him alert to a fox in the yard, or a stranger on the road, but she had never seen him quite like this, utterly silent, utterly focused, a low sound building somewhere deep in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine, something in between, something that made the small hairs on her arms rise before she understood why. "What is it, boy?" she asked, crossing the cracked ground toward him, and as she got closer, she caught it too. Beneath the heavy stink of sulfur that hung over the whole property, something else, faint and strange, a dry, old smell like paper left too long in a closed drawer, like dust settled thick over something that had not been touched in years. The bathhouse door groaned when she pushed it, swinging inward on its one working hinge to reveal a single small room, empty except for a rusted iron tub half collapsed in one corner, and years of leaves and dust drifted across the warped floorboards. Sunlight came in thin and gray through gaps in the roof, catching the dust she'd stirred loose so it hung and turned slowly in the still air, like something suspended between one moment and the next. The whole place had the particular hush of a room that had not heard a human voice in a very long time, and Josephine found herself lowering her own voice without quite meaning to, as though speaking too loud might disturb whatever it was that had kept this room so quiet for so long. It looked, at first glance, exactly like what it was supposed to be, an old abandoned, useless little shed, nothing more. We should tell you now, this was only the first small piece of what her father had left buried in that ground, and it would be some time yet before Josephine understood just how far the truth beneath her feet actually reached. But Samson would not stop. He pushed past her into the room, went straight to the far corner beneath a section of floor that looked no different from any other, and began to scratch, low and insistent, at the warped wood, whining now in earnest, looking back at her over his shoulder as if to say, "Here, here, why won't you look here?" Josephine knelt beside him, and ran her fingers along the boards where he scratched. Most of the floor was rotted soft with damp, but this section, she realized slowly, was different. The wood harder, tighter fitted, the nail heads a shade darker than the boards around them, as though someone had gone to the trouble of replacing this one patch of flooring long after the rest had been laid down and left to rot. It was not a repair, it was a hiding place, built with care, meant to look like nothing at all to anyone who was not looking closely, or to anyone who did not have a dog willing to stand over it and refuse to move. She sat back on her heels, heart beating faster than the moment probably called for, and looked at Samson, who looked steadily back at her, tail giving one slow, solemn sweep across the dusty floor, as though satisfied, finally, that she understood. Whatever was under those boards, her father had known about it, and whatever it was, it had been sealed away carefully enough, and hidden well enough, that Josephine understood, kneeling there, in the ruin of that old bathhouse, with the sulfur wind rattling the loose boards overhead, that this was not going to be a simple thing to open, and not going to be a simple thing to explain once it was. She had no tools with her, nothing but her bare hands, and the boards would not give no matter how hard she pried at the edges with her fingers. She walked the 2 miles back to town in the last of the daylight, Samson trotting alongside her the whole way, and returned the following morning with a crowbar borrowed from the mercantile and a lantern in case the light gave out before she finished. The work was harder than she expected. The boards had been fitted tight and nailed down firm, and it took the better part of an hour, sweat soaking through her collar despite the cool morning air, before the crowbar finally found enough purchase to pop the first board loose with a groan of old dry wood, and a shower of dust, that made her cough, and turn her face away. Samson sat close the entire time, not scratching now, just watching, ears forward, that same low stillness in his body, that told her this mattered, that this was not nothing. Beneath the first board was packed earth, hard and undisturbed, but as she worked the second and third boards free, the crowbar struck something solid a few inches down. Not rock, but metal, dull and cold under a thin layer of dirt. She dug with her hands after that, fingernails black with soil, until she had uncovered the corner of a small iron strongbox, no bigger than a bread loaf, its surface pitted with rust, but its lid still fitted tight. It took another quarter-hour of careful digging to free it fully from the packed earth, and when she finally lifted it out and set it on the warped floorboards, her hands were shaking, though she could not have said whether it was from the effort or from something closer to fear. The lock had rusted nearly solid, but it gave way after a few sharp strikes with the flat of the crowbar, and when Josephine lifted the lid, the hinges shrieking in protest after however many years of silence, she found the box lined with waxed cloth gone brittle and yellow, and inside it, wrapped carefully to keep out the damp, a thick bundle of papers. Even this, she would come to learn, was only the surface of it, a first thread pulled loose from something woven far deeper into the history of Cedar Falls than she yet understood. She lifted them out with trembling fingers. The top page was a ledger sheet, her father's own careful handwriting unmistakable even after all these years, columns of names and figures she did not at first understand. Beneath it lay something older and more formal, a document with a wax seal, cracked but still intact, and a heading, in bold official script, that made her breath catch in her throat. The original founding land grant of Cedar Falls, dated some 30 years back, listing not one owner but a dozen, the founding families of the town, Widow's Fork among the parcels named, its mineral and spring rights explicitly reserved to the collective, not to any single man. Beneath that lay letters, a dozen of them at least, tied together with twine gone soft with age, and near the bottom, a smaller separate ledger, filled with her father's same careful handwriting, tracking payments, payments made, and payments that had stopped abruptly, 6 years back. Payments that should have gone to a dozen families across Cedar Falls, and instead, according to the careful notes in the margin, had gone somewhere else entirely. Josephine sat back against the rusted tub, the strongbox open in her lap, Samson's head resting heavy and warm against her knee, and understood, slowly, and with a rising cold feeling in her chest, that her father had not left her a worthless piece of land at all. He had left her the truth, buried and waiting, about something far bigger than either of them, something that reached into every household in Cedar Falls, and pointed, unmistakably, toward the polished, patient, unbothered face of Silas Crane. The weeks that followed were unlike any Josephine had known before, quiet and urgent all at once, spent poring over her father's papers late into the night, by lamplight with Samson stretched across her feet, and by day, walking the 2 miles out to Widow's Fork and back, so often, that the path wore smooth and familiar beneath her boots. She did not understand everything at first. The old founding grant was written in the stiff legal language of 30 years past, and the ledgers were coded in her father's private shorthand, the kind he had used for his own working notes, never meant for another set of eyes. But numbers, she reminded herself, do not lie, and she had spent her whole life learning to read them. Slowly, patiently, the shape of it came clear. 30 years back, a dozen founding families had pooled their claims to settle Cedar Falls, agreeing that certain shared resources, timber rights, water rights, and the mineral and spring rights beneath several parcels including Widow's Fork, would remain collectively owned, with profits divided equally among the founding names, administered by whoever held the town bank. For 20-some years, that arrangement had held. Then, 6 years back, around the same time a young banker named Silas Crane had taken over the institution from his retiring predecessor, the payments to the founding families had simply stopped, quietly, one by one. Each family told some different story. The spring had run dry, the timber claim had lapsed, the paperwork had been lost in a fire. Except her father, meticulous to his bones, had kept his own shadow ledger of every payment that should have come and never did, and had traced, patiently over years, exactly where that money had gone instead. Into land purchases across the county, into a second set of accounts, into the quiet, careful expansion of Silas Crane's personal fortune. There was a name at the center of it all, one she had already begun to suspect, though she was not yet ready to say it out loud. She could not do this alone, and she knew it. She brought the papers, at last, to old Mr. Abernathy, a retired circuit lawyer, who had known her father for 20 years, and lived now in a small cabin at the edge of town, more interested these days in his garden than his old profession, until Josephine sat across his kitchen table, and laid the founding grant and her father's shadow ledger out before him. He read in silence for a long while, spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, and when he finally looked up at her, his face had gone pale and grim. "Your father was building a case," he said quietly. "A careful one. He must have known Crane would come for him the moment he got too close, and hidden the proof somewhere Crane would never think to look. A worthless piece of land nobody wanted, that only his own daughter would ever have reason to dig into." Together, over the following weeks, they worked to confirm what the papers suggested, cross-checking names against the ledgers, tracking down 2 of the founding families still living nearby who confirmed, in careful, quiet conversations at their kitchen tables, that yes, the payments had stopped. Yes, they had been told the same vague excuses. Yes, they had simply believed the bank because there had seemed no reason not to. Samson went with her on every visit, staying close, alert in a way that felt less like nervousness now, and more like readiness, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that they were building toward something, and that his place was beside her, until it arrived. It was Abernathy, in the end, who pointed out what Josephine had begun to suspect on her own, that Silas Crane's sudden, almost eager offer to buy Widow's Fork the very week her father died, was no coincidence at all. He had known, or feared, that Thomas Hartwell had kept evidence somewhere. He had simply never guessed where, and had been trying, quietly and patiently, to buy back his own exposure, before anyone thought to look. Word reached Silas Crane, as word in a small town always eventually does, that Josephine Hartwell had been seen coming and going from Abernathy's cabin, with a stack of old papers under her arm, and that she had been asking careful questions of certain families around town. He came to find her himself, on a gray afternoon, a little more than a month after she had first pried up those floorboards, striding across the cracked earth of Widow's Fork, with two of the town's constables trailing uncertainly behind him, his patient smile stretched thin and brittle at the edges. "Miss Hartwell," he said, stopping a few paces off, close enough that Samson rose at once from where he'd been lying near the spring, and placed himself, steady and unhurried, directly between Josephine and the banker. "I understand you've been telling stories around town, wild ones, from what I hear. I'd hate to see a grieving young woman, alone in the world, embarrass herself further with unfounded accusations against a man who's done nothing but try to help her." "I'm not alone, Mr. Crane," Josephine said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, did not shake. "And they're not stories." She held up the strongbox, its rusted lid open, the papers inside it visible in the gray afternoon light. "This is the founding land grant of Cedar Falls, with your predecessor's own signature on it, naming 12 families as collective owners of the mineral and spring rights on this land, and 3 others. This is my father's ledger, tracking 6 years of payments that should have gone to those families, and instead went into your own accounts. And these," she said, lifting the bundle of letters, "are statements from 2 of those families, confirming under oath before Mr. Abernathy that you told them lies to explain why the money had stopped." What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years afterward, told and retold until it took on the shape of legend. For the first time since she had known him, Silas Crane's patient smile faltered entirely. "That land," he said, his voice losing its careful softness, sharpening into something colder, "is worthless scrubland. Nobody would believe. My father believed it was worth enough to hide the truth on it for 6 years, rather than risk you finding it," Josephine said. "He was a careful man, Mr. Crane. A ledger never lies. You should have remembered that before you started forging one." Crane took a step forward then, something ugly moving across his face, some final calculation of a cornered man deciding whether threat might still work where charm had failed, and Samson met that step with a low, steady growl that stopped him cold, not lunging, not snapping, simply immovable. A wall of loyal fur and bared teeth planted between Josephine and any harm that might come to her, and Crane, to his credit or his cowardice, did not try a second step. It was Abernathy, arriving a moment later with 2 more witnesses, and the county sheriff summoned from the next town over, who finished what Josephine had started. He laid the founding grant and the shadow ledger side by side on the tailgate of his wagon, walked the sheriff through 6 years of numbers with the patient, unhurried care of a man who had waited a long time to be useful again, and watched the sheriff's face harden with every page he turned. There would be more to untangle in the weeks ahead, he warned them both: bank examiners from the territorial capital, a formal hearing, months of paperwork, but the shape of it was already plain enough to any honest man willing to look. The founding grant was authentic, verified against county records that Crane himself had never thought to alter, believing the original safely destroyed in a fire some years back, that Josephine now understood had not been entirely an accident. The shadow ledger, cross-checked against bank records the sheriff seized that same week, matched to the penny, every missing dollar accounted for, and traced back to Crane's own quiet acquisitions across the county: land, cattle, a second house 2 towns over that none of Cedar Falls had ever known existed. Within a month, Silas Crane had been stripped of his position at the bank, his personal accounts frozen pending a full accounting, and the 12 founding families of Cedar Falls, Josephine among them, were owed 6 years of withheld payments plus damages, a sum that made the $14.60 she'd once counted out at Pruitt's counter seem like something from another lifetime entirely. Crane left Cedar Falls before the frost that year, on a stagecoach nobody troubled themselves to wave goodbye to, and the town that had once laughed at poor foolish Josie Hartwell now could not seem to stop talking about the quiet, careful woman who had outthought the smartest man in the county, with nothing but her father's ledgers and a dog who would not stop growling until she listened. It took the better part of a year to settle everything properly, the county accounting, the restored payments to the founding families, the slow work of clearing her father's name, and alongside it, her own. By the following spring, Josephine had used her share of the recovered funds to rebuild the old bathhouse at Widow's Fork from the ground up, this time as what it was always meant to be: a proper spring house, clean board walls, and a good tin roof. The sulfur water piped into 2 tiled pools that folks came from 3 counties over to soak in, paying a fair fee that Josephine kept in a ledger of her own, careful and honest, the way her father had taught her. She built a small house beside it, modest but sound, with a porch step that did not creak. Samson slept most days now in a patch of sun near the spring, gray coming in around his muzzle, content in a way he had not been since the winter Thomas Hartwell died. Sometimes, in the evenings, Josephine sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, and looked out over the land the whole town had once called worthless, and thought about how close she had come to selling it, how close she had come to believing what everyone told her, instead of trusting the small stubborn voice that said her father had never done anything without a reason. It had not been her own cleverness that started it all, not really, but a dog's steady, patient nose, and his refusal to walk away from something the world had already decided did not matter. We think about that a great deal when we tell stories like this one. How often the things we're told are worthless turn out to be exactly the things worth digging for, if only we're patient enough, and brave enough, to listen to whoever or whatever is trying to tell us where to look. So we'll leave you with the same question Josephine might ask, if she were sitting here with us tonight. If you found a hidden piece of history, buried and waiting, would you keep it, or would you share it?